Hello there, everyone. If you're watching this video, then you are part of the TTOR army, an army that is building itself up one subscriber at a time. The subject of today's video is actually responding to an interesting comment someone left for me over last weekend. The comment was made on this video, which you can see right here on screen, which is called Paulogia claims sin doesn't exist in order to avoid being held accountable for his sins. And this is actually the highlighted comment at the moment. YouTube set it as the highlighted comment. I didn't. And there's a number of claims that this user named 10-Minute Trips makes that, well, they're worth responding to, and they're pretty hilarious. And since I'm short on time and I don't want this to be a long video, let's get right into it. 10-Minute Trips says, before I get to my comment, let me start by saying that opening your video with a supposed PSA and then going right into a pitch for some new app you created is misleading and dishonest. A PSA is something like ride a bike, wear a helmet, or see train tracks, assume a train. That's a PSA. Your pitch was a commercial ad for your own product. Why not admit up front that you're working on paying the bills? Now, he's referring to my little promotion of Quarter at the beginning of the video. And the problem with making this comment is that I don't use Quarter to pay the bills. Quarter is a video sharing site, just like YouTube, that anyone, including you 10-Minute Trips, can use and start uploading videos to for free. So saying that I'm running Quarter to pay my bills is a complete lie and shows that you're trying to convince my audience that I'm trying to sell them a product, when in reality, I'm not selling them anything that would make me money. It costs me money every month to have Quarter online. I don't make money off of it. As a matter of fact, if I wanted to save myself about 130, maybe 150 bucks a month, I would just can Quarter entirely and move on from it. So yeah, nice try, but I'm not working on paying the bills by running a video sharing site. I'm trying to give people a platform where there's no fear of censorship and you can say and do whatever you want as long as it falls under the protections of the First Amendment and American law. So nice try there, 10-Minute Trips, but lying about why I made Quarter isn't gonna fly. Now to my comment. Your argument that atheists claim that sin doesn't exist so that they can avoid being held accountable makes absolutely no sense. Let me begin my counter-argument by saying that the so-called Apostle Paul was a scamming grifter who made unsubstantiated claims that he saw a risen Jesus and that he somehow had authority to dictate what would eventually become Christian doctrine. I don't believe for 1 second that Paul ever saw a risen Jesus. To me, he has about as much credibility as most Christians would assign to Joseph Smith of Mormon fame. In other words, not one bit. I'm not so much an atheist as I am an anti-Paulist. Without Paul, Christianity is nothing. It never happens. With Paul, it's a cult. So we got to stop right there. This guy claims that Paul was a scamming grifter who made unsubstantiated claims that he saw a risen Jesus. First of all, Paul is not the only person who saw a risen Jesus. There were 499 other people who saw the risen Jesus as well, which includes, among others, all of his disciples who walked with, talked with, and ate with Jesus for 3 years. Secondly, Paul could not possibly have been a scamming grifter. If you look at who Paul was prior to becoming a Christian, he was the Pharisee of Pharisees. He was at the top of the food chain in Judaism. He had all the power and authority that a scamming grifter could ever want. And since he was that high up on the Judaism totem pole, he probably had access to all the wealth that a scamming grifter could ever have wanted. So if Paul was a scamming grifter who was in it for money and power and authority and control over others, he would have just stayed in Judaism for his entire life. So why would the Apostle Paul go from being the top of the food chain in Judaism, having all the power and authority and presumably wealth that society could offer him, why would he trade that all in to become the champion of the Christians he was hunting down and murdering? And why would he endure the scourgings and the beatings and being left for dead and being imprisoned and being shipwrecked and having himself defamed by everybody? Why would he trade all that power and authority and control and wealth to live that horrible life? Well, the simplest explanation for why Paul would do that is that he actually did get visited by the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. That event actually happening is the simplest, most logical explanation for why the Apostle Paul went from being the Pharisee of Pharisees who was hunting down Christians like dogs and putting them to death to becoming the champion of Christianity who wrote half of the New Testament, most of which while he was imprisoned, and planted churches all over the known world, and led a lot of people to Christ. That doesn't happen unless the risen Jesus actually came to Paul and said what he said in the book of Acts. 10-Minute Trips goes on to say, young earth creationists buy into Genesis nonsense because Paul said so. Gotta stop you right there, 10-Minute Trips, because anyone who's watched my content for a long enough period of time knows that when I provide biblical data that proves that the Bible teaches a 6,000-year-old earth and universe, not once, ever, do I quote the Apostle Paul. I come to that conclusion without the Apostle Paul. Now, I have no doubt that Paul would have endorsed young earth creationism because, one, the early church fathers that old earth creationists like to quote as being supportive of their worldview, they were young earth creationists. And two, Jesus taught that male, female, and marriage came into existence at the beginning of creation, which is a statement that can only be true if young earth creationism is true, and Paul probably agreed with Jesus that male, female, and marriage were created at the beginning of creation. Now, I say Paul probably believes that, but it's probably more of a certainty and less of a probability. 10-Minute Trips continues. As an atheist, I have as much respect for the Bible as I do for The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Probably less because the Bible isn't all that great reading. Boring. So, 10-Minute Trips claims that the Bible is boring to read when compared to things like The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Well, that's kind of a weird conclusion to come to, 10-Minute Trips, because when you read stories in the Old Testament, like the story of Samson, where you see a man who was literally empowered by the Holy Spirit, and when the Holy Spirit would come powerfully upon him, he would tear lions to pieces with his bare hands and kill 1,000 trained professional soldiers with his bare hands and a donkey's jawbone. That's not boring. That's the kind of stuff that superhero stories are actually based on. And as I've talked about in past videos and live streams, the story of Samson actually is the kind of things that led to the rise of our modern day superhero stories that we have in comics and movies. A lot of these story elements that you see in most superhero stories and movies are actually present in this story of Samson. So the Bible is anything but boring, especially if you're into superheroes and people with superpowers, because the Bible has superheroes in it, except the difference between the biblical superheroes and the ones that you see in today's entertainment industry is that the biblical superheroes were, one, not over-exaggerated like modern-day comics and cartoons, and two, actually happened in real space-time history. 10-Minute Trips concludes. The bottom line is that when you claim that atheists deny sin in order to avoid accountability, your mistake is in thinking that atheists give any credence to the biblical idea of sin. And oh, by the way, Paulogia won't debate Kent Hovind because while in his mind Kent may have repented for his sins against God, he hasn't repented for his sins against actual people. So according to 10-Minute Trips, my mistake is in thinking that atheists give any credence to the biblical idea of sin. But that's the whole point of my video that you're commenting on, 10-Minute Trips. If you're an atheist and you deny that God exists, you don't give any credence to the idea of sin because sin is a crime that you commit against God. Well, if that God doesn't exist, then you can't commit a crime against him. So therefore, sin doesn't exist. And the logical conclusion that comes from that is that, well, if there is no God that exists and you therefore can't commit a crime against him, i.e. sin, then obviously you will never be held accountable for the sins you commit against that God because that God doesn't exist and the crimes that are made against him don't exist either. You cannot be held accountable for a fictitious crime against a fictitious being. So thanks for proving the entire point of my video. And that's one of the things I love about these random atheist commenters who come onto your video and leave their comments is they really think they're getting you in their comments, but in reality, they're actually proving the entire point of the video that they're commenting on. These guys are suffering from the Dunning-Kruger effect, where they think they're a lot smarter and more clever than they actually are. And 10-Minute Trips is one of those people. Well, folks, I have nothing else to say about this comment. Hopefully you found this about as entertaining as I did. And if you did, be sure to hit the like button and leave your own comments down below. And be sure to subscribe to the channel and all of that jazz. Thank you for watching, and have an excellent day.